Hey, apes, welcome back. And here is to another unit with Miss Hoskins. This time we're on water pollution, my favorite. Water pollution is 5 parts. First, we're going to talk about wastewater from humans and livestock, and then talk about the heavy metals and other chemicals that can pollute water. We'll have to definitely mention oil pollution, and then non-chemical water pollution, which is an interesting topic. And then we're going to wrap it all up with legislation. You guessed, water pollution laws. Wastewater from humans and livestock. By the end of this section, be able to discuss the 3 major problems that are caused by wastewater pollution, and also explain the modern technologies used to treat wastewater. Regardless of the specific contaminant we're talking about, pollution can come from either a point source or a non-point source. A point source is the distinct location from which the pollution is directly produced. So an example would be a particular factory that's pumping waste directly into a stream, or a sewage treatment plant that's discharging wastewater right into a pipe that goes directly into the ocean. Non-point source is a more diffused area that produces pollution, like an entire farming region or a suburban community with many lawns and septic systems, or storm runoffs from parking lots. Yeah, you can use that one. So the distinction between the 2 sources can help us control pollution in a variety of ways. All right, so if a municipality can determine 1 or 2 points of sources for most of the water pollution, it can basically target these specific sources and reduce the pollutant output almost immediately. So controlling pollution from non-point sources is much more challenging because it basically represents a negative externality. And it also represents not only large real estate area, but also a community as a whole. We've seen before it's difficult to address these negative externalities since they're really not typically reflected in the cost of making things. Environmental scientists are concerned about wastewater as a pollutant for 3 major reasons. All right, so first, wastewater dumped into bodies of water naturally undergo this decomposition by bacteria, which create a large demand for oxygen in the water. Secondly, the nutrients that are released from waste, just in general, decomposition can make water way more fertile. And thirdly, wastewater can carry a wide variety of disease-causing organisms, because if you think about it, most disease is aquatic. So we're going to look at these 3 things in a little more detail. When organic matter enters the body, microbes that are decomposers feed on it. And because these microbes require oxygen to decompose waste, the more waste that enters the water, the more microbes grow, and then the more oxygen they demand in order to eat the waste. So the amount of oxygen and quantity of water used over a long period of time at a specific temperature is what we call BOD. It's biochemical oxygen demand. Lower BOD values indicate that water is less polluted by wastewater, but higher BOD values indicate that a water body is more polluted by wastewater. If we were to test BOD of a natural water over a 5-day period, in like a liter of water, we'll say, we might find that the BOD of 5 to 20 milligrams of oxygen coming from the decomposers of like leaves and twigs and perhaps even a few dead organisms. So in contrast, wastewater might have a BOD of like 200 milligrams of oxygen. So when microbial decomposers use large amounts of oxygen in a body of water, the amount of oxygen remaining for other organisms is obviously it's very low because they use it all up. So low oxygen concentrations are lethal to many organisms, including fish. Shocker. Low oxygen can be lethal to organisms that don't move, like plants and shellfish. And so when this happens in a large area, we call that a dead zone. Becoming so depleted from oxygen that little life survives there, dead zones can be self-perpetuating organisms that die from a lack of oxygen, then decompose themselves, and they cause microbes to want even more oxygen. So it's kind of like a death cycle, if you will. When wastewater decomposes, it releases nitrogen and phosphorus. You may recall from an earlier section where we talked about nitrogen and phosphorus. They're generally two of the most important elements for limiting abundance for producers in an aquatic system. So the decomposers of wastewater release nitrogen and phosphorus, which in turn they provide an abundance of fertility to the water. So a phenomenon known as eutrophication happens. As we talked about before, like at the Chesapeake Bay story, everything experiences a eutrophication from wastewater because the decomposition of all of the water there, as well as the nutrients that are leached from like fertilized agricultural lands during precipitation, it's all happening. So when the body of water experiences an increase in fertility due to any sort of anthropogenic inputs of nutrients, we call that cultural eutrophication. Essentially, eutrophication initially causes this rapid growth of algae, and we know that as an algal bloom, and we've discussed that before. This is an enormous amount of algae that eventually die, and microbes then rapidly begin to digest all of that dead algae, and then they increase in microbes that consume most of the oxygen in the water. So in short, the release of nutrients from wastewater initiates a chain of events that eventually lead to a lack of oxygen and the creation of dead zones once again. So one of the most impressive dead zones in the world occurs in actually the Mississippi River, where it dumps into the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi River receives water from 41% of the land in the continental United States. Each summer, there's an influx of wastewater and fertilizer that causes this large algal bloom, followed by a substantial decrease in oxygenated water and basically a massive die-off of fish. So while some of these dead zones arise naturally, most are caused by human activities. In 1910, 4 dead zones were known around the world in total, and this number has increased to 87 dead zones by 1980 and more than 400 by 2008. And, that's actually probably the most recent count because it would probably be pretty scary to go out and count it now. In addition to dead zones, we also have to talk about some disease-causing organisms. So for centuries, humans have faced the challenge of keeping wastewater from contaminating drinking water. This has been difficult because throughout the world, many people routinely use the same water source for drinking, bathing, washing, disposing of sewage, you name it. So wastewater can carry a variety of pathogens like viruses and bacteria and even protists. Pathogens in wastewater are responsible for a number of diseases that can be contracted by humans and even other organisms. And also, it can even be contracted by ingesting water. So one of the most famous disease pathogens from water is cholera. Another one would be typhoid fever, pretty much a lot of versions of the stomach flu, and then, of course, diarrhea. All right. So worldwide, the major waterborne diseases are cholera and hepatitis. Cholera, which, claims thousands of lives annually, believe it or not, in developing countries, it's really not common in the United States at all. However, hepatitis A is appearing more and more frequently in the U.S., and usually that's from originating in things like restaurants that lack adequate sanitation. So the Bactrim Cryptosporidium, it's caused a number of outbreaks of this gastrointestinal illness in our country. Large-scale disease outbreaks from municipality water systems are relatively rare in the United States, but they do occur on occasion, and they're relatively common in many regions of the developing world. So the WHO estimates that 1.1 billion people, nearly 1/6 of the world's population, do not have access to sufficient supplies of safe drinking water. In addition to that, half of the 3.1 million annual deaths from diarrheal diseases and malaria could be prevented if all people had safe drinking water. and proper hygiene, by the way. So, approximately 42% of the world's population lacks access to proper sanitation, and over half of these people live in China and India. Also, like sub Saharan Africa, only 36% of the population has access to proper sanitation. Because the risk of pathogens are high in water, in contaminated water, we need to have the ability to easily test for the presence of these pathogens in our drinking water. It's not really feasible to test for all the many different types of pathogens that exist in drinking water. Instead, scientists have settled on what we call an indicator species, and that's an organism that indicates whether or not disease-causing pathogens are likely to be there. The best indicators for water that can tell you that water is potentially harmful are fecal coliform bacteria. And that's a group of, usually they're pretty harmless microorganisms, but they live in the intestines of human beings and other animals. And one of the most common species of fecal coliform bacteria is, can you guess? That's right, E. coli. Most strains of E. coli live naturally in humans, and they're not harmful, believe it or not. But although there are strains that that we hear about in the news that can be very deadly, and especially to young people, even people who are very old, basically anybody with a weak immune system. So, given that E. coli is commonly found in human intestines, detecting E. coli in a body of water is a reliable indicator that human waste has entered the water system. This does not necessarily mean that the water is harmful to drink, but the presence of E. coli does indicate that an increased risk that the wastewater pathogens are actually there. Public water supplies like drinking water sources and even swimming pools, those are usually routinely tested for E. coli. And homeowners with single family might as well like test water, more frequently. And sometimes, single family homes, they don't test water at all. But the public health authority recommends that, declaring some sort of water unsuitable for human consumption if basically any bacteria is present. So essentially what that means is that when our drinking water is treated at the plant and it goes into the system and comes into our homes, basically the tolerance for the amount of E. coli that is in that water is 0. So if they get one E. coli culture, they have to stop and completely redo their process.